Welcome to this webinar, Unraveling Bias and the Brain. We will explore how our brain can work against our best intentions and identify ways we can be a kinder and more inclusive human. I'm Dr. Megan Pollack. As an engineer turned educator, I am focused on engineering equity into education and the workforce. My mission is to provide services, tools, and resources that inspire awareness and initiate action. I do this because I envision a world where personal and social circumstances are not obstacles to achieving potential, and where kindness, inclusivity, and conservation prevail. Since 2008, I'm a speaker, teacher, researcher, writer, and consultant on topics related to engineering, education, and equity. After thousands of speeches and workshops across the globe, I welcome the opportunity to help your organization strive towards an inclusive and equitable environment. My tools are developed with the primary goal of moving from awareness to action, available on my website and Amazon. In addition, free resources such as posters, teaching tools, reading lists, helpful posts, white papers, and more are also available on my website. Now let's get started. First off, everyone has a brain and everyone has bias. These are facts, and the purpose of this webinar is not to prove them. The purpose of this webinar is to help us unravel bias in our brains. Because if we use our brains to understand and combat bias, we can create a more inclusive and just world. In this webinar, we will review some of the barriers to an inclusive and just world, outline 14 key terms to add to or reinforce your vocabulary, examine 8 neural mechanisms in our brains that support prejudice and stereotypes, the underlying functions of bias, and finally, identify 9 self-regulation strategies to reduce prejudice and stereotypes. So let's think for a moment. What does a more inclusive and just world mean? To me, it's a world where personal and social circumstances are not obstacles to achieving potential. A world where differences are honored and not feared. A world where true equality is a given, a norm. A world where kindness, acceptance, and love prevail. Sure, this may seem very idealistic, and perhaps it is, because we certainly aren't there yet. That being said, what are the barriers to an inclusive and just world? Let's look at some of the definitions to help us examine the barriers. These definitions will be important for the conversation on the brain. First, we have prejudice. Prejudice is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. Within the field of social psychology, prejudice refers more specifically to attitudes and emotional responses towards a group and its members. Discrimination is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people. People can be discriminated by race, gender, socioeconomic status, religion, sexuality, ability, and age, to name a few. Oppression is the combination of prejudice and power, which creates a system that discriminates against some groups and benefits other groups. Examples of systems are racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, ageism, and anti-Semitism. There are 4 types of oppression: ideological, interpersonal, institutional, and internalized. These systems overlap and interact. Systems of oppression enable dominant groups to exert control over non-dominant groups by limiting their rights, freedom, and access to basic resources such as healthcare, education, employment, and housing. The 4 I's of systemic oppression will be covered in more detail in another webinar. However, the key takeaway is that these systems are designed by people and upheld by people. Stereotypes are a widely held but fixed, oversimplified, and generalized image or idea of a particular type of person or thing, including personal traits or circumstantial attributes. Stereotypes can become ideological beliefs held within one's culture that lead to assumptions about characteristics, behaviors, and social norms. Marginalization is the treatment of a person, group, or concept as insignificant or peripheral. Marginalized groups refer to individuals who are consistently confined to the lower or peripheral edges of society or groups, because they are commonly seen as different from perceived norms and dominant cultures. They often experience disadvantage and discrimination that stem from the systemic social inequalities and injustices. Micromessages are small, subtle, unconscious messages that are sent and received when communicating with others. Micromessages can either be positive micro-affirmations or negative micro-inequities that communicate value to an individual. Micromessages are relayed through not only words, but also nonverbal communication. In addition, micromessages are sent by what is said or not said, or what is presented or not presented. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect one's understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Implicit prejudice is in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. These are often unrecognized and may not align to one's declared beliefs and values. Prejudices, stereotypes, and consequently bias often operate in combination to influence our behavior. If we can unravel these in our brain, increase our understanding of how they happen, we can begin to shift our behavior and better contribute to a more inclusive and just world. Ready for a little neuroscience? In our brains, the function of neurons constantly fluctuates as we engage in different activities. From simple tasks like grabbing your cup of coffee to complex tasks like understanding systemic oppression and neuroscience. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, the fMRI, is a technique for measuring and mapping brain activity. The invention of this technique has allowed us a deeper understanding of the brain. Research over the last 3 decades using the fMRI tells us that networks in the brain support the learning, experience, and expression of prejudice and the storage, activation, and behavioral expression of social stereotypes. We also know that networks in the brain support the self-regulation of cognitive control, which can reduce the expression of prejudice and stereotypes. My goal is to inspire awareness and initiate action. This is the action piece. Self-regulation is the ability to manage one's behaviors, including the ability to set specific goals and to use appropriate strategies to attain those goals. Or it is the process of acting in an intentional manner, often through mechanisms of cognitive control. Throughout this webinar, I'm going to provide you with strategies to help you contribute to a more inclusive and just world. Strategies will be identified by slides with this image. First up, let's understand our brain. I want to acknowledge the white paper, The Neuroscience of Prejudice and Stereotyping by David Amadeo, as it provided the images and framework for the neural mechanisms of social cognition that underlie forms of bias that you'll be introduced to today. The amygdala responds to motivationally relevant cues, aversive or rewarding, that guide adaptive behaviors. This includes social motivations, such as the desire to affiliate or compete with others, which is one of the most powerful human drives. This type of motivation leads to a discernment of us from them. This mental computation takes just a fraction of a second, yet it sets the stage for social categorization, stereotypes, prejudices, intergroup conflict and inequality, and, at the extremes, war and genocide. Given this, studies directly implicate fear conditioning as a mechanism underlying implicit prejudice. This is because there are patterns of amygdala function with respect to intergroup responses. One pattern reflects a learned threat response to racial outgroups, which is rooted in fear conditioning. Fear conditioning refers to the pairing of an initially neutral stimulus, such as a light or a tone, with an aversive fear-eliciting stimulus. The conditioned fear response is described in terms of emotional, behavioral, and physiological responses. The most famous example of human fear conditioning is the case of little Albert, an 11-month-old infant used in John Watson and Rosalie Rayner's 1920 study. Like most babies, Albert had a natural fear of extremely loud noises, but no aversion to white rats. So, Watson and Rayner presented him with a white rat, and when he reached to touch it, they struck a hammer against a steel bar just behind his head. After 7 repetitions of seeing the rat and hearing the frightening noise, Albert burst into tears at the mere sight of the rat. In addition, Albert showed some generalization of his learned fear response. He would cry at the sight of objects that resembled a white rat, including a white dog or a white coat. Fear conditioning may be acquired in a single trial and expressed primarily through behavioral freezing, anxiety, and heightened vigilance. Social prejudices are scaffolded by basic level neurocognitive structures, but their expression is guided by personal goals and normative expectations. What irrational fear conditioning can you identify in your life? One of the most common racially motivated and irrational fear conditioning is of black men in hoodies being dangerous. I want to read a brief excerpt from Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele about New York Times columnist Brent Staples. In the book, he relays a story that Brent reflects on from when he was a college student at the University of Chicago. As a young African male, he talks about his experiences walking in his informal clothing, like a hoodie, down the streets of Chicago's Hyde Park neighborhood. These are Brent Staples' own words. I became an expert in the language of fear. Couples locked arms or reached for each other's hand when they saw me. Some crossed to the other side of the street. People who were carrying on conversations went mute and stared straight ahead, as though avoiding my eyes would save them. I'd been a fool. I'd been walking the streets grinning good evening at people who were frightened to death of me. I did violence to them just by being. How had I missed this? I tried to be innocuous, but didn't know how. I began to avoid people. I turned out of my way into side streets to spare them the sense that they were being stalked. Out of nervousness, I began to whistle and discovered I was good at it. My whistle was pure and sweet, and also in tune. On the street at night, I whistled popular tunes from the Beatles and Vivaldi's Four Seasons. The tension drained from people's bodies when they heard me. A few even smiled as they passed me in the dark. What this story talks about is his experience with people's fear conditioning. They had been conditioned to be fearful of a black man in casual clothing walking through a certain kind of neighborhood. But as his behavior changed, which is not something that is his responsibility, as his behavior changed as he was whistling Vivaldi, the assumptions, the fear conditioning that's associated with someone who can walk the street and whistle Vivaldi changed. And so I want you to think about, what about other people who are, maybe people who are experiencing homelessness? Do we have a conditioned fear response to people in those circumstances? What about fears that immigrants are taking all of the jobs? In what circumstances do you experience behavioral freezing, anxiety, and heightened vigilance? Can you rationalize this fear conditioning based on your own personal experiences? Next in the brain is the insula, a part of the prejudice network. The insula is frequently associated with responses to racial outgroup versus in-group members in experimental tasks. These findings are interpreted as reflecting a negative visceral reaction such as disgust to racial outgroups, and has been specifically associated with white subjects' implicit negative attitudes towards black people. Thus, the insula seems to contribute to the emotional affect that is often experienced as part of the prejudice response. The insula is also implicated in pro-social emotions such as empathy towards liked individuals. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. For example, insula activity was found to increase when subjects viewed another person being exposed to a painful stimulus, but only if that person was of the same racial group. Similarly, another study observed insula activity when members of liked but not disliked outgroups were harmed. Both findings suggest that empathy-related activity in the insula depends on the victim's social affiliation. According to Dr. Brené Brown, empathy is a skill that can bring people together and make people feel included, which is very different than sympathy, which creates an uneven power dynamic and can even lead to more isolation and disconnection. It can be easy to jump to conclusions about people. Because of how implicit bias works, we are prone to assign stereotypes negatively or at least untruthfully. Most of the time, we don't know the whole story. One of my favorite tools taught to me by my mentor, Tegwin Pulley, is to ask the question, what else might be true? You'll notice in the phrase that there are 5 words. How I use this tool is when I find myself sort of honing in and assigning a stereotype or making an assumption about some person or their actions or their intent, I try to stop and ask what else might be true. And because of the 5 words, I try to come up with 5 different explanations to what might be happening. And by doing that, it really dissipates that focused attention that would have normally gone straight to a stereotype or a negative assumption. And by doing this, it helps us to give people the benefit of the doubt. It helps us to be very careful and not assigning stereotypes and not assigning negative intent and negative assumption to people's actions. And so by doing this, it's a way to begin to practice empathy. It helps us to begin to drive connection with other people. A big piece here is to get to know someone. When we know people, we are better at having empathy with them. And know this, that it's a skill. We must practice empathy to become better at it. Part of the prejudice network, the striatum, is broadly involved in instrumental learning and reward processes, including the coordination of goal-directed and habit-based responses. Findings from functional neuroimaging research suggest that this portion of the brain is associated with the value placed on a potential action and its anticipated outcomes. Also part of the prejudice network, the orbital frontal cortex is often considered to include the inferior ventral medial prefrontal cortex and is associated with the processing of feelings, learned associations between a certain behavior and a specific consequence, evaluation, and decision making. In the social domain, the OFC supports the monitoring of social cues and subsequent adjustment of one's behavior. This function is crucial in intergroup situations involving social norms in which responses may be influenced by others' expectations. The medial prefrontal cortex is involved in both the prejudice, stereotyping, and regulating networks. The medial frontal cortex is an important structure for the processing of social information. In the context of social cognition, MPFC activity has been primarily associated with the formation of impressions about other people, especially impressions that require mentalizing. Mentalizing is the process of considering a person's unique perspective and motives. According to Chris and Uta Frith, mentalizing is the process by which we make inferences about mental states. Much of the time, these inferences are made automatically without any thought or deliberation. It is important for us to be able to read the minds of others because it is their mental states that might predict their actions. This process has been interpreted as reflecting a humanization process and by extension, empathy. So a lack of medial prefrontal cortex activity in response to a social target may indicate a form of prejudice that is characterized by dehumanization and a lack of empathy. Dehumanization is the process of depriving a person or a group of positive human qualities and the literal stripping of human attributes with an animal or object type association instead. Examples of dehumanization include, during the Holocaust, Nazis referred to Jews as rats. Natives were dehumanized as savages who stood in the way of westward expansion. White supremacists referred to black people as apes. Black people were kidnapped, transported, and enslaved like animals. Women abducted into the sex trade are treated as objects or property. Immigrants are termed and treated as vermin, animals, or an infestation. Dehumanization is viewed as a central component to intergroup violence because it is frequently the most important precursor to moral exclusion, the process by which stigmatized groups are placed outside the boundary in which moral values, rules, and considerations of fairness apply. Dehumanization starts with language. Words matter. People are not property. People are not animals. We must consider how stereotypes, prejudice, and bias affects how we see and engage with others. I encourage you to examine the ways in which you've perhaps unintentionally stopped seeing groups of humans as humans. Ask yourself, what else might be true? If mentalizing is the process of considering a person's unique perspective and motives, how could your lens affect your assessment of others? Is your lens clouded by a narrow worldview? Is your lens out of focus to the humanity of others? Is your lens one of empathy and kindness? Evaluate the state of your lens and make a plan to adjust it accordingly. Stereotypes reflect conceptual associations between social groups and a particular set of attributes. These associations that are thought to reside in semantic memory. Social information represented in the anterior temporal lobe is selected into the medial prefrontal cortex to support the process of social cognition. Thus, the knowledge of social stereotypes appears to reside in the anterior temporal lobe. Stereotype retrieval and implementation happens in the left inferior frontal gyrus and response inhibition on the right AFG. Thus, stereotypes are activated and applied. So, with intentional effort, aka self-regulation, we can inhibit the influence of stereotypes on behavior. The recommended strategy here is to watch, read, and learn. One of the TED Talks that's my absolute favorite that really is beneficial in helping us to increase our understanding of the power of stereotypes is called The Danger of the Single Story. It's a TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie. The quote here is the sort of general preface of her talk, and she says that the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And so watching TED Talks like the one from Chimamanda and reading books by people who are different from you, who have different perspectives than you, and really seeking opportunities to learn is going to help you challenge some of the stereotypes and single stories that you might hold about others. On my website, there are a long list of books that you can read and different kinds of videos that you can watch. And so I definitely encourage you to find your way to my website for those references. Stereotypes reinforce the marginalization and oppression of others. We must actively challenge stereotypes, dispel myths, and provide more authentic stories of individuals. The last part of the brain we're going to examine is the anterior cingulate cortex. The ACC has been widely implicated in the monitoring and detection of response conflict. This means that cognitive control is needed to curb the personally unwanted influence of implicit stereotypes and prejudices on behavior. In 2 fMRI studies in which subjects completed implicit association tests measuring racial attitudes, false feedback was provided to the subjects indicating that they showed racial prejudice, and it elicited heightened anterior cingulate cortex activity. And this degree of activity was associated with feelings of guilt, a self-regulatory emotion that promotes pro-social behaviors. The control of implicit bias requires the detection of a conflict between a biased tendency and one's goal to act without bias. You can take implicit association tests to help you identify your unconscious biases. Awareness is the first step to action. Remember that networks in the brain support the self-regulation of cognitive control, which can help us reduce the expression of prejudice and stereotypes. Let me recap the strategies that we've learned today. First, we need to know our brain. It's not important for you to remember each of the different parts of the brain, the different neural mechanisms. The point is that you understand that there are networks in our brain that support our understanding of prejudice, that support our prejudices and biases, that support the stereotypes that we know and hear. By understanding that there are networks in our brain that manage those two things, and that there is also a network that manages our self-regulation of those things, we can begin to have greater control and power over the prejudice and stereotypes in our brain. Second is to examine your fear conditioning. Look at the times when you have heightened anxiety, when you are like freezing, or when you're having a sort of visceral kind of reaction. Look at these kinds of times in your life and think about, why are you experiencing these kinds of emotions and these kinds of physical responses? Is this fear conditioning that you're witnessing, is it based on your true experience? or is it based on stereotypes and prejudices? Number 3, practice empathy to drive connection. This is asking the question, what else might be true? It's really making sure that we begin to humanize others. When we humanize other people and make sure that we aren't unintentionally dehumanizing them by referring to them as animals or objects, or not seeing the humanity and who they are and the experiences that they have, we begin to further marginalize and oppress others. Next, we have to change our lens. How is our perspective of the world, which is based on our lived experiences and based on what we know, how is that affecting how we interact with and engage with others, potentially in a negative way that doesn't reflect our intent or values? Number 6, watch, read, and learn. This is a journey. It's a journey of continuing to know more about yourself and more about others, and there's so much information out there. Read books by people who don't look like you. Watch films about stories and lives that are not something that's your lived experience. What this doesn't mean is to go ask your one Black friend about their lived experience. It is not their responsibility to help you understand their entire culture, nor can they truly speak for their entire culture. And so while you might have friends that are willing to help you and to share their stories, be aware that that can become a big burden for them if they're having to do that for all of their friends who are unaware of their culture. We must actively challenge stereotypes, whether they're in your own language or whether they're in the language of your colleagues. We must stop them, address them, and say, that's a stereotype and it's unfair to people who don't fit that normative label that we've been given to them. Number 8, we need to learn how to identify our implicit biases. By doing so many of the things that I've just listed here, that will help you begin to understand what are some of the biases and the prejudices that you hold. And while you can certainly take an implicit association test, it's not the only way to understand what your biases are. The point is that through thoughtful reflection and through intent, we can become to realize what are those biases and how are those biases manifesting in our behavior that are sending signals to people that are further marginalizing them and oppressing them. And I have one last strategy. Silence is complicity. By not saying anything, by not standing up for those who are marginalized and oppressed, we become complicit in their oppression. In this webinar, we reviewed some of the barriers to an inclusive and just world. We outlined 14 key terms to add to your vocabulary if they weren't already there. We examined the 8 neural mechanisms in our brain that support prejudice and stereotypes, the underlying functions of bias. And we identified 9 self-regulation strategies to reduce prejudice and stereotypes. Our goal was to unravel the bias in our brains to help create a more inclusive and just world. When we learn about bias in the brain, we can better connect to our heart. When we connect to our heart, we can change our behavior to be more kind, empathetic, and inclusive. When our heart and brain work to combat prejudice, stereotypes, and bias, we can dismantle systems of oppression and together create a more just world. Thank you so much for your time today. If you'd like to host this webinar for your team, you can. Additional options are to make this webinar an interactive workshop either in person or online with time for discussion or polling and chats. We can extend the time and also focus on certain topics if you choose. I want to share some additional opportunities and resources with you for those who choose to be on this journey of self-regulation to reduce the expression of prejudice and stereotypes. For those that are experiencing bias and discrimination and seek advice on how to manage situations, and for those who want to be upstanders and advocates for the marginalized and oppressed. I hope that you'll write to and tune in to Call Bias Busters podcast. The format is like a mix of the perennial Dear Abby advice column and the erstwhile New York Times Dear Sugars advice column turned podcast. Submit letters or request to be a guest host at callbiasbusters.com. Check out these webinars and more on my website, meganpollock.com/webinars. recommended reading lists and interesting videos, you'll find those on my website as well at meganpollock.com/read or /watch. You can explore all of the resources on my website, and I encourage you to see what I have available to you and how I can help you. And then finally, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you so much for your time, and I wish you a great day.